The House Criminal Justice Committee will come to order. Would the clerk please take attendance?
Chair Hope.
Here.
Representatives Andrews,
Here.
Carter, Green, Young, Arbit,
Here.
Devendorf,
Here.
Cerniglu,
Here.
Filler,
Yes.
Mueller,
Here.
Bazat, Harris, Bagul.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 9 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you. Representative Arbit moves to adopt the minutes from the June 20th meeting. Without objection, the minutes are adopted. We're now going to hear testimony on House Bills 4634, 4635, 4636, and 4637. Representative Devendorf and I will be at the table, and we will go at ease. Yeah, you don't have
I would like your photo and your vote.
Committee will come to order. Here to testify on House Bills 4634 to 4637 are Representatives Kara Hope and Representatives Emily Devendorf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a couple of days ago, we heard an overview of the Juvenile Justice Task Force and the work that they did, some of the recommendations they made, and I'm here to testify about fines and fees for young people who end up in the system. They're inefficient and inconsistently imposed. They exacerbate poverty for families, and they disproportionately harm youth and families of color. It's important to note right up front that these bills do not eliminate restitution to crime victims, nor do they eliminate funds to the Crime Victim Compensation Program. These bills instead advance the House's goal of meaningful criminal justice reform while respecting crime victims. Here in Michigan, Washtenaw and Wayne counties have already eliminated discretionary fees and stopped debt collection. Macomb County completely eliminated fines and fees for juveniles in their court system. Currently, Michigan juvenile courts are permitted and sometimes required to charge and collect fines and fees from youth regardless of their age. Because this is handled inconsistently from county to county, different parts of the state can have very different experiences when it comes to charging youth. The term for this phenomenon, and we've heard about this on other topics as well, is called justice by geography. These fees are significant and often burdensome. For example, an out-of-home placement for a juvenile can cost as much as $320 a day, leaving some families with a bill of $100,000. Some mandatory assessments can be waived, including costs for detention and residential placements, but those waivers don't happen consistently, even within counties or across the state. Not surprisingly, counties with the highest percentages of so-called working poor have the worst collection rates collecting as little as 13% of fees. And according to a 2020 analysis of SCAO data, only 25% of the assessed juvenile court debt was actually collected during 2017 to 2019. Juvenile courts in Michigan can and do legally pursue payments until the debt is paid in full. When the youth turns 18, the debt may be retained by their parents or transferred to the juvenile who is now an adult. The consequences are long-term and sometimes dire. Families are unable to pay their child's debt, and they can find themselves with their tax funds being intercepted and even their wages being garnished. In addition to making juvenile justice more consistent from county to county, these bills would help reduce racial disparities that are part of the juvenile justice system. In 2019, Black youth made up 17% of Michigan's population of young people. They accounted for 37% of arrests, 41% of detention placements, and 19% of longer-term confinements. So the current system is not only ineffective and inefficient, it can do more harm than good by disproportionately affecting families of color and locking families into poverty for years. We have the chance right now to lead in criminal justice reform regarding juveniles and make a meaningful difference in the lives of kids and their families. And I will turn it over to Rep. Devendorf.
Thank you, Representative. I testify today on House Bill 4636 in regard to late penalties. My bill removes the application of the late penalty currently imposed by juvenile courts if the juvenile fails to pay a penalty in full or if they pay it late. As we talked about already with the bills that we passed out of committee prior, the bills that we are putting before the committee today are a result of recommendations by a bipartisan and nonpartisan Michigan Task Force on Juvenile Justice Reform. And their extensive recommendations reflect extensive research around the burdensome, unfair, and inequitably applied late fees that add to our immense outstanding court debts. These fees have already been abolished, in part or in full, by 14 other states. As Representative Hope mentioned, we have at least 3 Michigan counties that have decided through research and experience that pursuing the collection of these fees does not yield rehabilitation. It also does not yield additional funding. Research shows that juvenile court debt follows juveniles and their families long after juveniles have emerged from the juvenile justice system. All the more concerning is the documented disparate application of the fees to juveniles who are Black, brown, and or living under the poverty line, adding to the impossibility of fee recovery from communities that already face systemic obstacles to social stability. Tongue twister. Fees are also applied inconsistently across the state. And we know that the fees do the opposite of what we want them to. Juvenile debt correlates with increased risk of recidivism, racial and ethnic inequalities, and financial and emotional hardships for, of course, the entire family, as we are talking about fining juveniles. Eliminating the fees, as I said, will not erase any consistent source of funding for our courts, as juvenile court fees are so often left unrecovered due to the juvenile and their family's inability to pay that we are not funding anything through those fees. In Macomb County, 60% of families that were communicated with about their fees were found to be indigent or with income below the poverty line. Families interviewed by the Michigan Center for Youth Justice reported an average of $87,165 in court debt. Collections are actually found to cost our court systems, and because of that, the cost of personnel and trying to pursue the recovery of these fees, we are actually losing money when we are not also replacing it. While we understand that these court fees are not yielding the results that we need, we also understand that eliminating these fees will help us to facilitate the rehabilitation our juvenile court system seeks. Thank you.
And if I could add, Mr. Chair, these bills were part of a bipartisan package that was introduced last term, but which didn't make it through the process. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, and we'll open up for questions. I believe we have a question from Representative Mueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned in your testimony that there's 3 counties that have elected not to do this. Which counties are they?
Ooh, jeez, sorry. Macomb, Wayne, and Washtenaw.
Okay. If they can do this already without legislation, would you consider, you know, there's been this big kick in another committee I'm on about local control, right? So if places like Washtenaw, where I happened to work as a deputy before, and other, you know, city or counties like Genesee or Wayne County, where there is where the youth are getting in trouble more, higher population, poverty levels are a little bit higher. Why don't we do it local control where, let's say, a county up north doesn't want to do this, then they don't have to, because in the end, the taxpayers are paying the bills for the criminality of people that commit crimes that aren't paying their fees. Because somewhere we have to be able to keep our courts running, and that money is going to come from somewhere that's taxpayers that we all pay. So I just don't think it's fair that I'm going to have to pay to keep the courts running in these counties that want to get rid of their fees.
So, right now, only about 25% of the fines and fees are actually collected. So it's not a successful endeavor, and I think it was Macomb County that actually found that it was more expensive than productive to pursue these debts. Regarding funding, we do have a fairly substantial appropriations bill that we'll hear eventually, which increases the child care fund.
Right, I understand. I mean, I understand the philosophy behind it too, but I mean, if you take the money that we're going to spend to do this and what we spent to, no offense to the audience about raise the age, even though he tied my bow tie today, you know, the local control issue is why not let these people just figure it out for themselves? I'm as you can tell, I'm kind of not for this, but I can see what you're saying, but I said it might not work for everybody, because think of it this way, that big amount of appropriations that you're going to be asking to do this, we can put that into juvenile detention facilities where we can have more mental health, we can do all kinds of things and get at the root of the problem, so we're not fixing a problem that could be money spent trying to fix something that if we put it towards the problem at the very beginning, then we're not going to find ourselves in this situation. Because there's going to be a lot of money, and how many, you know, we don't have juvenile detention centers in some counties. We don't have mental health facilities in some counties, especially when you go up north, and we're going to spend all this money to get rid of court fees in the most populated areas in our state. Well, the rural areas don't even have a place to take a child that has a mental health problem.
If I may, one of the points that we're trying to make is that the court system already is not funded through these fees. The funding that the court systems use in order to continue operating already has to come from somewhere else because of the inability to collect these fees, because of the disproportionate impact on our impoverished communities. Because of that, we are not losing money by saying we can't get it from this source, because we are not getting it from this source. We are, however, acknowledging that we still need to fund our courts. We need to find a place to source that funding. We know it isn't coming from here, and we know that when we leave some things to local control, there is that inconsistency that adds to the burden and the obstacles to opportunity and frankly rehabilitation, as we're saying. that depending on which community you're in. And as with other civil rights measures and efforts at rehabilitation and reform, we don't want who you are and how much money you have to determine your potential for being able to re-enter society after you've paid your debt, as in the actual reform that you participated in, since we're not able to pay the undue fines that exist. And we have to create that uniformity across the state.
Okay, I mean, again, we'll agree to. I understand your philosophy. It's the practicality of it. I mean, I agree that, you know, juveniles don't have the money. Sometimes they come from poor families. I get it, but you still have to have accountability for your actions. And the thing is like I said, and I'll leave it at that because we'll just agree to disagree on it, is that if Genesee County wants to do it, more power to them. They have a county commission that are elected by their people too, and county jails are run, you know, the commission does that. The judges are all underneath the county commission. So if you want local control, Genesee County might want to do it, but like I said, you know, Tuscola County might not want to. So that might be a way to see. And then you can look at the comparison between the two later on down the road to find out if it is actually working in our state or not, because we do have a diverse state.
As Rep. Devendorf said, when it comes to things like our justice system, we do want consistency throughout the state, and we don't want to leave it to local units of government. I mean, the county will still be responsible for operating whatever juvenile justice goes through their county, whether it's a lot or hardly any. And as far as accountability goes, it's not the person who did the crime who's paying these out. Usually, if they're even collected at all, it's the family that gets stuck with the bill.
And this does not forgive things like restitution. This does not forgive fees and fines that go along with what the court determines to be the way rehabilitation is going to show up and what the juvenile owes society in order to show that they are moving on with their lives. It merely gets rid of the fines that are added to the process that are not being recovered. The juvenile still is responsible for paying the debt to society in the form of whatever the court determines to be that decision and that repayment related to their crime.
All right, I think we have a couple questions from Representative Filler.
Sure, and I didn't practice in this area. Can you kind of educate me about how a judge picks fines and fees right now? Is it an individual committed a pretty serious crime, youth, and then they got housed in a local detention, so they pay for that? Is it, the amount of effort that went into arresting the individual? I mean, how does a judge make a decision right now?
I didn't practice in this area either. So with the chair's permission, I'd like to ask up Jennifer Peacock, who is from the Michigan Center for Youth Justice.
Absolutely.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So you can view it as a continuum of cost, right? So from the moment of first contact, there is actually a chart I can actually share with you right after this that actually provides almost a broad breakdown. Again, these prices do vary by county, but there is a broad guideline. So a standard assessment for DNA is typically $60, but all across the continuum, some states have even charged children for clothes, dentistry. It's a very spectrum as they go, but there are some rough, I would say, guidelines that I can provide you following this, if that's helpful.
That is helpful. Housing including or no? Sometimes?
Yes, and that can vary from anywhere from $315 a day to $600 in Michigan.
Okay, with the chair's permission, a quick follow-up. House Bill 4637, this is Glanville's bill, eliminate fees and costs on juveniles tried as adults. Now, I had a long talk with somebody who's supportive of this bill, and the way they described it, I'm going to do my best here on 4637. Okay, so sometimes youth are waived up into the adult system, and that's for the very serious crimes, arson, attempted murder, carjacking, really bad ones, okay? Essentially, the prosecutor says that is an individual who they need to be tried as an adult, and the judge says, I agree, and so they end up in the adult system. Then they have, I assume, adult fees and fines, but we're not waiving adult fees and fines. With this bill, and I'm going to make sure that it's written correctly, we are only waiving the blended waive. Is that correct? Where an individual, they say, we're kind of half waiving them up into the adult, but they still have juvenile fees and fines. Does that sound right? Am I reading this correctly?
You are in the zone, so absolutely. So that is what you're describing is a blended sentence. And so when a child is waived fully as an adult and they enter the adult system, they are an adult in the eyes of the law. Whereas let's say if a youth we're only eliminating fees for youth who were convicted as an adult, but the court has given them a juvenile sentence. So that might
Can
be.
you give me an example of how that would look?
Yeah. So
Because I just want to be frank with you, I had a real problem with an individual being waived into the adult system for like carjacking or kidnapping or something, and then being told, well, you're an adult in the state's eyes, but you are, you don't pay fees and fines.
No, I completely empathize with that concern, and I'm sure we could work together to provide clarity in this context as we can talk about these bills. From my understanding, I don't have a clear-cut offense example of where this would occur. It is, I believe, in the county court discretion, but one example where it could show up is if a child is placed in a juvenile facility for holding, that's where the waive of fines and fees would kick in. But if they were convicted of a serious crime and waived into the adult system, the fines and fees would follow as an adult. But I can certainly dig around to find clarity on an example of an offense where that would occur for you.
Thanks, Chair.
Representative Harris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you folks for being here. And I appreciate the insight on some of this. So, and forgive me if some of this kind of mirrors a little bit what Rep. Mueller said. So let me start with this. So do we have any data that shows juveniles stay incarcerated longer if these fees or fines are not paid?
We have seen studies and broad research that shows the longer children kind of carry this debt, the more likely they are to have extended probation. And then the longer young people are caught in this system, statistically it is more likely that they will get deeper and deeper and deeper involved, which is why things like diversion or those low-risk screening tools really help to catch kids early, to screen them out, and by alleviating that burden of debt, it's more likely that we're finding, and nationally those trends are showing that as well, that the debt can kind of deepen that involvement. I would have to kind of dig in to get you a number, though, truthfully.
But just as a follow-up, so I don't think they can stay incarcerated longer because of the fines and fees. And at least I know in my county, in Oakland County, we really don't have juvenile probation. It is more of a consent calendar issue, which is a little bit of a lighter probationary process. And I know I used to be a juvenile detective, and so I worked with the juvenile courts quite a bit. And I've seen individual judges and individual cases deal with, okay, this person's indigent or this person is having a really hard time, continuing with these fees. And when they saw success in other areas of this consent calendar, they worked with them on these fines and fees so they didn't have to, collect everything. But if they were showing an effort, good faith, and they were progressing in the system, then they ended up waiving those or at least reducing them. Does that sound similar across the state?
Do you want to answer does that sound similar? Because I can.
Across the state, as in, forgive me, I'm so sorry, but across the state, as in counties may waive these fees if young people are doing well in other programs?
Yeah, and I'm just intimately familiar with
Of
my
course.
county versus
I really
some of the
appreciate
other
your
ones.
work in Waterford, actually, but as an aside. But from my understanding statewide, that's the big struggle with this, is that it's so inconsistent. And so that can be the kicker is young people in good faith, they might be doing that, but for the young people who might be struggling and need more intensive services, that might mean that debt keeps following them. And so it is kind of a tough thing to speak broadly to, but every county has a different approach to the waivers process that you've described.
And I just want to add that, yes, while the fees can't keep people incarcerated longer, it does add to the likelihood of recidivism because of the obstacles of the financial burden and how it is most likely to be a financial burden for folks who already encounter systemic and financial obstacles. In addition to that, a lot of the difficulty that comes up in paying fees is not it does not necessarily reflect the fault or irresponsibility of the juveniles and their families. We know that folks who are under the poverty line move more often, have more difficulty with communication, being able to stay in communication, being able to keep their addresses updated, and also just a technological literacy. All of the ways that we notify folks that there is a bill, that there is a late bill, that there is a building debt, are often lost on folks who are under the poverty line because of how out of communication and out of reach they can be because of their poverty. So we have fines increasing for folks because they're struggling and we can't find them. And then when we can find them, we've just added to that financial burden when they already were going to struggle to meet it.
Representative Bagol, and then we'll have two other speakers coming up, so if we can hold other questions for the other two speakers after this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if any thoughts have been given to allowing the juveniles to work some of the fines off. I know at least some of the fines are revenue to the court to pay for the cost incurred. In Shiawassee County, there was opportunities provided through the probate court to have the juveniles work in the jail garden, and they were given credit toward their fines for that. Is that something that's been considered?
Not that I'm aware of. I will defer to Ms. Peacock, though. To me, that sounds like maybe forced child labor, which I don't like the sound of. But that's just me.
In this context, we find that our initial gut check would be no, to kind of establish this set. I'm going to call it workforce development in this context. And so what we have found, though, is that when young people have opportunities for those meaningful experiences, because I think what you're describing of providing young people opportunities to have these kind of restorative programs, rehabilitative programs, whether it's a community garden, mental health services, the kind of full spectrum of that community-based care that the Child Care Fund will enhance, young people tend to do really well in those hyper-local services, not because they're working off debt, but because they have a structured evidence-based program. And so by removing the burden of debt and providing young people access to meaningful workforce development is something we're passionate about at MCYJ. We're able to help build up young people. Oftentimes, these young people are lower income, and giving them meaningful workforce development experiences really help lift folks out of poverty. But when we set this standard that you must work off this debt, we run into a lot of that standardization process that's really hard for courts to kind of capture, right? How do we pick up the nuance of transportation for our young people, the cost of travel to get there, or kind of do young people is that the right fit of program? So it becomes this kind of tough gray area to set that as a almost standard to work off the debt when these are the future of our workforce. So if we want them working for Michigan. And so it's kind of this tug at play, but I definitely empathize with what you're saying of providing young people with those evidence-based programs that keep them out of facilities. But I think in the context of fines and fees, there's this tension that we see at play, at least in the advocacy space, at least in my perspective.
And we did hear from Mr. McKissick last Tuesday about his program where he's bringing kids in and they learn a trade. They're not working off debt. They're learning a trade, and that's part of their program. They actually get a stipend for their equipment and whatever they need to participate in the program. So I think, I'm not a child psychologist or anything like that, but to me that sounds like a more positive experience than working off debt.
It served as a beneficial program in a lot of ways. Taught them a skill. They had buy-in to the program, and it was voluntary, but it worked in our county, so that's something to consider.
I can't say enough, though, that we are continuing the conversation as if these fees are funding the court system, and they just are not. So even if we were to be able to successfully recover these fees, which we are not able to for a whole host of reasons, they are still not the source of our court funding, and they would just be additional funding. Would additional funding be nice? Yes, of course, but we're saying it is insurmountable for most of the folks that are most impacted. We have some families in a Macomb County report, and I'm happy to pass on any of these reports, including there's one called Minors Facing Major Debt from the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, that does bring up examples like one person who has been consistently paying what they could afford, which is $100 a month, and they've been doing it for decades. It already is something that is not affordable for them. It is not helping them to be more involved in the society in a positive way. And what it comes back to is that it is unaffordable in the first place for the folks that we are fining, and that us not getting those funds is not what is impacting the under resourcing and underfunding of our court system.
Thank you for your testimony, representatives. Committee will go at ease.
The committee will come back to order. And now we'll hear from Nicole Falds, who is the Juvenile Division Administrator for Macomb County. She can tell us about the experience there and perhaps take a couple questions. Thank you.
Thank you for having me and allowing me to join via Zoom on a pre-planned road trip that I'm on. But I did want to take some time to give some information about our experience in Macomb County. And I'd like to start with a brief history. Prior to 2020, all youth that came in on delinquency petitions, if they were adjudicated, went to diversion, any of that, we would ask that the family fill out a packet of financial information and return it to our reimbursement division. It was usually, I would say, about a 50% compliance rate of people actually filling it out and turning it in. We would use that information to assess whether they were below the poverty line. And if they were, our reimbursement division would request a deferral, not necessarily a waiver, but a deferral, usually for 2 years, and then they would be reassessed. For those that didn't complete the paperwork, they would get a bill for the full cost of residential placement, detention. We had some probation oversight fees that we charged. And so that was our standard practice. And in 2020, we partnered with MCYJ to really examine our collection practices, because unfortunately, of the 73 counties that reported collections data to SCAO, we had the most amount of outstanding debt, and it was a very large amount. And so we started to really examine the collections piece and what are we actually collecting, given that we had to fund an entire reimbursement division with 8 employees, and really examine the human impact that these fines and fees had on our families. And so, our probation officers were reporting kind of the opposite of what some people think about accountability and financial accountability and having some skin in the game or whatever. And we had families that they'd get their first bill, and if for a week detention or whatever, and they would be shocked by the amount. And then you would get a situation where we had families where maybe a child who was on probation was having significant behavioral issues in the home and things that might be considered a probation violation. and the parents would start to do the math if they could afford to have the kid go to detention and were actually not reporting significant behavioral concerns that we would like to address through referrals and probation oversight. Not, they didn't want to gamble with whether the jurist would choose to put them in detention for the violation. As other speakers have discussed, this disproportionately affects children and families of color. In our system, Black and brown youth make up about 46% of our detentions and about 51% of our residential placements. That was 2019 data. And so we are always, focused on that. That's overrepresentation, and we're trying to address those issues. And these families were being impacted by the fines and fees that we assessed. We found through our experience too, most of the families that had this large amount of debt where children were deeper into our system had housing instability, financial instability, were living barely paycheck to paycheck, maybe had other debts just to keep their household running, employment interruptions, those kinds of things. So for us, we have actually seen better now that we waive those fines and fees from the outset. We've seen better interactions and rapport with our probation officers, and my finance manager has actually said that we have seen some increased restitution payments. I think people avoided coming in to pay restitution because they also had to face the bill for detention, residential placement, tether, those types of things. With that gives you some idea of what we did, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And Ms. Peacock, would you mind returning to the table in case we have questions for you as well? Representative Filler.
House Bill 4637, I did notice on, I'm going to have to pull Section 8, that it says if the court, this is something that's going to be crossed out by this bill package, if the court appoints an attorney to represent a juvenile, an order entered under the section may require the juvenile or person responsible for the juvenile support to reimburse the court for attorney fees. So under this bill package, attorney fees is considered fees and fines too?
If you don't mind, I can take that one and you can add on if you'd like to. One of the recommendations that the task force made is to provide indigent defense for youth, both at the local court level and then also at the appellate court level. So that hopefully will become irrelevant.
So the answer is yes, attorney fees is part of, or you consider it part of fees and fines.
I'm saying there won't be attorney fees because they'll have their defense paid for by the Indigent Defense Commission. Representative Cerniglu.
Oh, I was actually just trying to comment before on some of the things here, but I guess this is all relevant. Again, I represented juveniles in several counties and have a lot of experience with this system, and just want to point out that for almost all of the juveniles I represented, their families were struggling, and that was I think had a lot to do with why they were in the positions that they were in, and that included severe financial struggles, and to add to those was not helping the situation at all. And if the goal of our juvenile system, which I believe it is rehabilitation, then we need to make the necessary changes for that rehabilitation to occur. And if that means that we have to absorb some costs in order to make that happen, in the long run, that is saving a lot more costs from having them go into the adult system, not only financial but societal costs. So I just think ultimately, we have to look at how the whole cycle is in effect. And I know a lot of us are doing that, but I just wanted to kind of add that comment there that I think in the long run, it really saves us a lot. And take those factors into consideration. I saw the same thing that the speaker on Zoom was talking about, is that families were thinking about how to avoid those costs, not because they didn't want to pay them, but because they couldn't pay them, and that was not what was best for the juvenile, for our society, for the whole system. So I'm happy that we are addressing those issues with those bills. Thank you.
If either of you would like to comment on that or elaborate, no? Okay. Representative Harris.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So this is a follow-up just on Macomb County as an example. So I know you made mention about, kind of the shocking numbers that come from either the fees that you are not able to collect or whatnot. Can you give us a ballpark idea of what percentage you're actually collecting and what that number might be?
Yes. So somebody mentioned there is a report that MCYJ did as a result. And so there is some of our collections data in there. So we worked with MCYJ and looked at years 2015 through 2019. And our average collection rate around them was about 7.2%. And we're talking about clearing about $140,000 in a year. That was, I believe, 2019. We cleared 140,000. After you took into account what we collect, we then have to split with the state because of the child care fund. So there's we'd get an administration fee, and then we would have to remit some of the what we collected to the state. And then once you factored in the cost for us to staff the division that did the assessment and collections and make the recommendations and those types of things, it was a collection rate of 7.2%, and it was 140,000 that we collected in 2019, above the everything that we had to remit to the state.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do I have time for a quick follow-up? So do you think, and I'm trying to, I know this is Macomb County, so I'm trying to look statewide, what's the potential impact for taxpayers, and do we think that the appropriation side of this that we haven't necessarily heard yet is enough to cover that for either one of you?
Is that for me? Sorry.
For anybody.
Oh, I couldn't speak to statewide what that looks like. I think, and the point has been made that there really is, it's like justice by geography. So what Macomb did might look a lot different than what Ingham does, which might look a lot different than a northern county would do. So I don't know what their collection rates look like, but I did hear the number 25% overall. So I think, I know there's been some discussion about the child care fund. So most of our budget is either child care fund budget or county general fund. So I guess each county would have to look at what that impact would be for them individually.
Okay, thank you.
One point that I'd like to make is we've been really fortunate to work with so many stakeholders who made up the task force, including those court administrators and those folks on the ground all across the state of Michigan who are very supportive of implementing it. And as soon as they heard that the child care fund increase was happening, it was just like Christmas. That is the linchpin to this, and MCYJ could not be more committed to seeing that through as well and supporting alongside all of you. But at this time, I have not gotten direct pushback from concerns as long as the child care fund continues forward in the context of concerns about that appropriation being enough.
Representative Devendorf.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the data because we helpfully heard from Macomb as to how much was actually able to be collected, and the rate was 7.2%, and it was not even $200,000. And yet the cost of the 8 personnel that are employed in order to try to collect, the reimbursement division, they're budgeted on The division estimates, this is from the report we keep referencing, and we're happy to pass out. The division estimates that the staff spent 60% of their time and budget on delinquency cases, and of the $691,580 total budget, they spent approximately $415,000 to collect on juvenile court debt. And that was in 2021, and we heard how little was able to be collected, even with paying that many people that much money and putting aside that much in order to fund the effort. It just is not cost effective.
This is a kind of a risky move on my part, but do you have any data about how money spent on diverting youth from crime is what type of money does that save people?
No, that's a very good, no, that's good, because I do view this, we can view this as a long game, right? It is to the point of, that has already been stated about when we catch kids younger, it is statistically much more likely to be cost effective. Now, sadly, I do not have the actual numbers in front of me, but what we have seen by and large, community-based care and community-based services are significantly cheaper for our young people than things like residential detention and kind of these huge court kind of fines and fees. And so I wish I had it in front of me, exact data, but there is a national trend. There's trends in Michigan in various counties. There's like the rural in-home care grant, for example, showed really great results when we provided those resources for counties to have those community-based services. And then many of them showed low recidivism rates. But I wish I had the numbers in front of me.
Thank you. Seeing no more questions, I'm going to read in the cards here. Bobby Dorigo Jones of Michigan's Children supports the bill, does not wish to speak. Samantha Gibson from the Michigan Association of Counties supports the bills, does not wish to speak.
Could you make clear what bills are being supported?
The ones that we've heard today, 4634 through 4637.
Thank you.
If they deviated from that, I'd point that out. Mitch Albers from the Department of Attorney General supports the bills, does not wish to speak. The Supreme Court Administrative Office, SCAO, supports the bills, does not wish to speak. The State Bar of Michigan supports the bills and does not wish to speak. Representative Filler moves to excuse absent members, and there being no objection, the motion prevails by unanimous consent. There being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.
Thanks.